All right. And welcome back, you guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast. I am your host, Corey Hageman. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in. Big shout out to you guys who are just so on top of, liking, commenting, engaging with my content in some form or fashion. Those of you who are subscribed to the channel, those of you who have the notification bell on, YouTube is fussy. And it's only going to push content that it deems is very exciting and very appealing. And I know with these longer episodes, this is kind of why I started the new format, is because they can be a lot to digest. So those of you who are, OG, you're committed, you've been here since those first few episodes. I appreciate it. And those of you who are new to the channel, I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you giving me your time. There's a lot of content out there. And really the goal with me putting any effort, any time into this, specifically on the PED side, which is probably why you're here on this video, is to help you make better decisions. If you are making decisions in and around using enhancements or supplementation, or if it's something that generally you just don't know, if you don't know, you haven't quite decided if that's something you want to do, but you want to be more informed. That is the purpose of my content. It's not to sell you anything. It's not to, sensationalize or refer you to, a clinic that I'm partnered with that I secretly get commission from. It's really just to give you information, and, you can use that information, as you will. And, I appreciate those of you who do kind of look at it through the lens of hey, this is entry level. This is for someone who is risk averse. Obviously, there are people who are here right now who follow me who are not risk averse, and they're hey, respectfully, I'm going to use a lot more, and that's okay. It is not my place to judge. It's not anyone's really. And I think in this realm, oftentimes people can hear the new format videos I put out. The first one was the starting dose of every PED, and there was definitely some backlash, especially on the male side of things. Men just got really, really irked because they're I have used way more, and if I had used less, I wouldn't have gotten the results. And yeah, I get it. It doesn't feel good for a bikini girl to go against what you're saying and kind of dismantle and be hey, maybe you could have gotten more out of less. Maybe you were a little aggressive. It doesn't feel good. I wouldn't like it either if someone's challenging something that I've done that I is an integral part of my belief. So I know some of y'all are so sweet, reached out and you're oh, it just it kills me seeing the negativity you get on some of your posts, and to be honest, it's very small in comparison. I am on social media, I see some of these bigger accounts, and they get it. It's just relentless, and it's very ugly and very hateful. And I'm fortunate that, I think I've done a good job of building a community, and you guys are great. So, extended intro just to give you guys a pat on the back. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tuning in. Let's kick this off. Let's get going. So who is this video for today? If you're here, then you saw the title, it's PED mistakes that will ruin your voice. Yeah, you know what? I'm leaning into the algorithm, but in actuality, I think this is something that we need to be aware of. This is something that I've talked about in exhaustion. And I think even if you are not a female, a biological female, I think as a male, if you're a coach, if you have a girlfriend who's in the sport, if you have girlfriends that I guess, I don't know, maybe you're not in a committed relationship, whatever, I'm just going to keep going. If you have friends that are females that, are interested in using enhancements, I think it's important, if they're not aware, to share this information. So even though a lot of these videos that are very much segmented, and I'm very much talking to specific female athletes, I guess not specific, just generally female athletes, for male listeners, those of you who are no, I need to know this information because I need to know where I could be fucking up if I'm a coach or if I'm doing my girlfriend cycle or whatever. this can also be applied for you. That's all I'm trying to say in a very lengthy, long-winded way. So today that is what we're talking about, is mistakes that will ruin your voice. And ruin, yeah, you know what, I'm exaggerating with that, because I mean, frankly, like, you could be perfectly happy with changes that happen to your voice, and it could not bother you at all. I have several professional bikini competitor friends who have experienced virilization, and they're just like, yeah, it's actually okay. Like, I'm not bent out of shape about it. It's not the end of the world. I'm very careful now. And then others who are like, I don't give a shit, like, whatever. I had a very high voice to begin with, so I've got more runway here. That's what we're getting into today. And I think this starts with understanding the fact that changes to your voice, for many, those aren't just minor annoyances. Like, fundamentally, this can impact your self-image. It can impact your personal life, how you identify as feminine, how you express your femininity, and even in professional opportunities. And yes, when you look at the other, potential reversible side effects, including hair loss, acne, and, like, changes in, like, body composition, so water retention, sure, which isn't like a huge deal for many because we're not talking about excess. All the way to the other end of it, where irreversible effects, it is vocal changes in clitoromegaly, which we're not going to get into clitoromegaly, and I can't promise you that I'm going to do a whole video on that, even though I will say, fun fact, in the medical textbook that I'm using as reference for another project that I'm working on right now, there are definitive, like, there's criteria for what clitoromegaly is. So I don't know, we'll put a pin in that for now and just keep rolling with vocal changes. So hopefully by the end of this podcast, you can understand exactly how these vocal changes occur. And I do want to parallel them to what trans men experience when they undergo testosterone therapy. And the top 4 mistakes that female athletes make that essentially, I wouldn't say guarantee, but increase the likelihood, increase the probability of a deeper, a variable voice that is not what they were biologically born with. So I'm also going to talk to you about how you can reduce the risk if you do still consider using anabolics. So first, I want to set the stage. If you are a female athlete flirting with the idea of using an anabolic androgenic steroid, you may have heard that certain individuals, they experience side effects, and to the degree in which these side effects are highlighted and disclosed is highly variable. You've probably heard of, acne breakouts. You may have even heard, more in a colloquial sense, like changes in mood, heightened libido, maybe a little water retention. But the side effect that truly can redefine your identity, and for many people can be very upsetting, is permanent vocal changes. So a cracked voice, it might not revert after you stop taking these compounds. And sure, there are technically surgical options that can reverse it, but these are often expensive and risky and are not guaranteed to restore a feminine pitch. To really drive home the permanence of these changes, we can actually take a look at trans men who have intentionally undergone hormonal therapy. They're intentionally raising their androgen levels, typically with testosterone, not always, to develop masculine characteristics, including a lower pitch. Now, full disclaimer, this is something that is highly variable to the individual within that community. So it's not to say that everyone who's making that transition is necessarily looking to be hyper masculine. And it's not to say that vocal pitch is like their defining factor, but I would say, like, it very much is to our advantage to understand this process. And I would say, in my own understanding of, like, ways to minimize the risk of virilization and androgenicity, this is something that we certainly can't ignore, and we really should be taking advantage of these well-designed studies that we have access to. Once these vocal folds thicken and lengthen, there really is no going back. Because of the fact that this cartilage is laryngeal cartilage is in adults. It's not in adolescents who are going through puberty, which is thought to be more pliable. And in effect, we're looking at when someone undergoes hormone therapy in order to increase androgenicity, or in the case of the bodybuilder who is not necessarily looking to incur this effect, but does incur this effect, we're looking at essentially a second puberty for the voice, but in a body that's already matured. Now, the end result is your old vocal tone doesn't return, even if later down the road you drop the hormone therapy. I emphasize this because many females think that, okay, well, as long as I discontinue the drug, if anything changes, it should normalize. Or on the contrary, as long as I don't stay on it indefinitely, any changes that I incur as soon as I remove it, it'll go back to exactly how it was. And unfortunately, this is not the case with your voice. Unlike muscle mass or water weight, your vocal folds won't just snap back. So when we look at individuals who are deliberately using testosterone to deepen their voice and adopt more masculine traits, you have to understand that the vocal folds actually thicken and then they vibrate at a lower frequency, and that pitch is going to drop over time. Now, this process can take anywhere from a few months to a couple of years to stabilize, often following stages like within the first 3 months. There could be some increased in hoarseness, cracking. So kind of like with adolescents or males going through puberty when their voice breaks. Then you look at the 3 to 6 month period, noticeably some deepening in pitch, but still a little bit unstable. 6 to 24 months, full stabilization. And this is heavy asterisks because obviously this depends on the individual who is undergoing this kind of sex change and their desired goals. So this is very, very general, and I want to make that super clear. And for female listeners or individuals who are like, well, I'm looking to not incur any of these things, not a single one of them. This is where we can kind of extrapolate from this, is that at higher doses or prolonged exposure of drugs that are highly androgenic, we do see that this happens in biological females who are looking to transition. So I'm really trying to hammer this home because I think there is the belief that at a low enough dose, you can continue to use a drug for an extended period of time without ever incurring side effects. And by side effects, I'm specifically referring to vocal changes. And with this, we have to respect the fact that prolonged exposure, even at a very low dose, can incur these effects. Like, it has been proven to happen. And even if it happens over a very long horizon, we still need to understand this with our total lifetime exposure. So for the athlete who's going to be competing for another 5 to 10 years, this needs to be a consideration in how many bouts of exposure we're subjecting them to, especially if they have a long career path ahead of them that does entail potentially anabolic use. Now, I think it's important to understand women produce far less testosterone than men. And if you look at any reference range, depending on the lab that you're looking at, you'll see ranges of serum testosterone levels from 15 to 70. I frankly have seen it lower than this. And, you have to understand, like, this is going to vary lab to lab. However, introducing exogenous steroids, that can send that androgen level skyrocketing, sometimes into the hundreds or even thousands. And this is an enormous leap relative to the female baseline, which, especially when we're talking about individuals starting TRT, even non-competitors, just individuals who are looking to address lower levels of hormone due to those changes biologically as they get later in life. We can't just layer on testosterone and approach HRT in the same way that a male would. So I think it's important to understand that not all PEDs come with this risk of virilization. It really comes down to the ones that are anabolic androgenic steroids, because they do have some androgenic component, whereas other PEDs, so specifically if we're talking about growth hormone, clenbuterol, T4, T3, these are all ones that are non-anabolic, non-androgenic steroids. And although they might carry other risks, virilization is not one of them. So since we're focusing on voice, anabolic androgenic steroids, those are going to be the big issue here. All right, and mistake number 1, using the wrong drug. Now, not all anabolic steroids are created equal. Some are notoriously harsher on females' voices. Some have a higher propensity, a higher androgenicity profile relative to its anabolic profile. So when we look at certain drugs like Anavar, Primabol, and Mastron, these are DHT derivatives. They carry less of that androgenic baggage. But it's important to understand that less doesn't equal zero. And in the context of using these drugs, this is always under the assumption that the drug that you're using is actually that drug, which in the case of Primobolan, that is something that even today is very dicey. Now, this is why, specifically for the individual who's considering TRT to restore normal to normal high levels, we need to ensure that those levels are not becoming super physiological, because testosterone in itself has a pretty high androgenic potential. And this is also why we have to be really cognizant of how we're going about administering testosterone, because in the case that you're using something like a pellet that you're implanting in the body, and let's say that dose that you put in is too high. Well, most pellets take anywhere from 3 to 6 months to fully dissolve. This is going to be a problem if the dose that you start at is too high and thereby putting you in super physiological territory, which, disclaimer, that is the case for 100% of the times that I've worked with individuals who have been on pellets. I've never had someone come to me and say, yeah, you know what, they put the pellet in, I got my levels checked, and I was under that threshold of 100 nanograms per deciliter. I can say that I see the most virilization with individuals who've been on pellet therapy on account of they can't scale that dose back. Now, in the sport of bodybuilding, you have another compound that is very popular, stanozol, also known as Winstrol. This is one that I do see a lot of use within the wellness division as well as the figure and physique division. Now, this is one across the board I don't see a lot of success with. I have never recommended someone use Winstrol because, frankly, we have better options that have a lower androgenic potential. But anecdotally, the individuals who have historically used Winstrol have reported bouts of virilization, whether that be through deepening of the voice or clitoromegaly. Now, another one to be mindful of is nandrolone, so MPP. Now, nandrolone is not a DHT derivative. It is a 19-nor, and it is one that I'll say for some performance individuals, there could be an argument to be made to have it in, yet for bodybuilders, for my demographic of bodybuilders, I don't really see a strong argument for it. And realistically, another concern I have with it is how it modulates free testosterone. Now, this is one that for individuals who are already on TRT, we need to be aware of, especially for individuals who already have a high degree of circulating free test or have high levels of DHT. So really, when we look at best practice, I'm going to lean towards using a DHT derivative. And second to that, of those three that I mentioned, Anavar, Primabol, and Mastron, I'm going to look at using the one that there is a high belief that it is the drug I think it is. And realistically, yes, you can test it. And I would definitely recommend doing that if you are risk averse. But in the case that you're not able to feel confident that the drug itself is actually what you think you're getting, it could be worth shopping around. Mistake number 2, using a safe drug at too high of a dose. Now, let's say you pick Anavar and you select it because it has a low androgenic potential. And you know a source and you feel good about where you're getting it from, and you know other women who have gone through the same source, and you feel confident that it is not going to impact you in a negative way or unwanted way. Now, where I see people really screw up is they get excited about using a drug and they hear what other individuals have used, and they begin to use that to craft essentially their cycle design. All the while thinking that if they need more muscle, they should use more of the drug, at least to begin with. And really where I think a lot of people fall into the trap is going through a cycle and using, let's say, a starting dose of 2.5 milligrams or 5 milligrams of Anavar and thinking, well, I still need more muscle. Maybe I should use double that. Maybe I should use 10 milligrams or potentially even more. Now, yes, I know in theory, more drugs are going to be more effective, but we really have to consider what does this translate to in terms of anabolic potential versus androgenic potential. And when we really look at building muscle, it's not going to be something that we can extrapolate and assume that if 5 milligrams of Anavar allowed me to build 5 pounds of muscle, 10 milligrams will allow me to build 10. It doesn't work that way. And I would be really cautious of thinking that because Anavar is female friendly and it does come with less of a risk, that you have more runway to push up in terms of the dose. Realistically, if you don't want to incur changes, you should be using the lowest dose needed to achieve those results. I've had people come to me who have been taking 15, 20, 30 milligrams of Anavar for bikini competitions, like not even at the professional level, just to get to the national level. And I look at their physiques because I'm nosy like that. And I'm like, you're so far behind from a conditioning standpoint from where you need to be. And the fact that you're using 30 milligrams of Anavar a day as a national level bikini competitor and not smoking the people around you, like that should be a conversation you have with your coach. Now, when deciding escalating the dose, yes, there is a systematic way to do that, but largely I would say that if you can get more out of less, take advantage of that before just escalating up blindly. And no, 6 to 8 weeks at a low dose or even let's say a mild dose, there is no way to guarantee that your vocal cords are going to change, that they're going to thicken, that they're going to lengthen. But this is something that I would largely recommend if you notice any kind of physical changes, any anatomical changes, or you're finding that, hey, it's just getting harder to hit certain notes if you're singing or if you're talking or if you're just finding I'm really having to clear my throat a lot. I'm noticing as I speak a little bit louder or as I hit higher pitches that my voice is cracking. These are not things to ignore. And this probably should have been its own mistake, but I'm just going to bundle it in here. If you're starting at 5 milligrams for the first 4 weeks, no, you do not need to go up to 10 milligrams for the next 4 weeks and so on. It doesn't work that way. Mistake number 3, using a drug for too long. Now, some women might think, and I've fallen prey to this as well, that, if I'm using the lowest dose possible, I can use it for an extended period of time. And realistically, why wouldn't I? Because I'm going to look better. I'm going to train better. I'm going to feel better in my sessions. And realistically, I think this is where we need to have a firm understanding on what these drugs are best used for. If you look at the name, anabolic androgenic steroid, it is best used for building muscle. And sure, as you escalate into divisions that have higher muscularity needs, there is going to be some gray area in how these drugs are used. But largely for the bikini athlete or the recreationalist or the hobbyist competitor, this is not something that we need to have in place just as a staple, as a baseline in a contest prep. I had a girl come to me not too long ago, and her coach had recommended that she run, I think it was Primobolan, and she was 2 or 3 weeks into her contest prep. And I'm like, I don't love that because she laid out her timeline for me and it was 14 more weeks. And she's like, yeah, it's not a super high dose, but the intention I imagine would be to have it in all the way through. And it was something that I kind of walked her through. I'm like, you're not really in a position to build muscle because you're in such a big deficit. And we see this in proof of the fact that you're losing a lot of weight. So by definition, you're not building, but you have this drug in place, working as an anti-catabolic. And this is where I think a lot of people go wrong, is they think that having it in during prep is harmless, even if it is at a low dose. And it's that total duration and exposure that you have over your lifetime that is going to lend to a higher likelihood of incurring these unwanted effects, which is why I think if we're going to use it in a contest prep, sure, there's merit to maybe having it in place at the end if we're trying to drive fullness, if we're trying to drive training performance, and largely the look would benefit from being denser. Yes, absolutely. Cosmetically, it can be an asset there, but we're not talking about over the course of 8 to 12 to 16 to 25 weeks. And if that's the kind of protocol you're following, I would have a conversation with your coach. I would definitely get clarity if it's something that's in place now very early on, and get a better sense of if this is something that they're going to have you continue to run the entirety of your season. And realistically, this could kind of be its own mistake, but I already formatted this video. I already decided this is how I'm going to do it. So I'm just going to embed this in here. Is using it in prep inherently isn't wrong, but I think it can be a slippery slope, because in the case that you're using it for those cosmetic effects, or you're using it to drive training performance the last 8 weeks, which I don't think is necessarily a great use for it, well, then where does that leave you post-show? A lot of people will want to put it in post-show as well. I don't recommend this. It's not a great time to grow. You're typically pretty run down and at a high risk for injury. And it's like, okay, you can put this in place and it sure is going to facilitate a very big physical change, especially if you're on plan. But realistically, you're not going to be in a great place hormonally to grow. And if you really need to build tissue, the goal needs to be putting that anabolic in place at a date where you've already proven, you've already like shown that like, hey, I have a well-designed program that drives muscle growth. And if you don't have that, then you're kind of just scrambling, letting the drug do a lot of the work, which, you know, you can still make progress that way. You're just not going to make as much progress, or there's a lower likelihood of you getting everything you can out of it, which ultimately perpetuates this cycle of then, well, I need to do more of the drug, or I need to do another cycle, or I need to do more, or I need to have a higher dose, or I need to keep it in longer, which I think is often just masking very poor planning. And there's a concept of lifetime exposure, and that ultimately lending to the likelihood that you virilize. And I almost think of it like each cycle is adding bricks to a wall. And even if each brick is small, in the case that you're using a lower dose, eventually you build that wall high enough to overshadow what you define as feminine. And again, I've said it so many times, and I think it's important to be very clear and accurate that like not everyone's definition of feminine is the same. So in the event that you're talking with another athlete or someone who's used enhancements in order to kind of assess whether or not their sourcing is safe, their dosing, their cycle design is something you want to follow, you have to be very clear on understanding, are the changes that you're concerned about, are those also a concern to them? Do they also share that same definition of femininity? Or were they willing to let certain things go? I would say typically 6 to 8 weeks is the longest cycle that I would recommend for the risk-averse bikini athlete, the individual who still has progress that they can pull out. And I do think it's really important if you're going to be doing multiple preps or back-to-back preps, which I understand, like that might just be the timing that you run into due to the national show schedule. This is something that you should really add up, like how many total weeks are you on cycle? And is this amount something that you're comfortable with? And when you can really weigh this against like, okay, the purpose of this compound is to create this compositional shift. Well, in the case that it's in place 12 to 24 weeks, even at a very low dose, it's like, well, is it needed? Is it actually necessitated for these weeks that you're not competing? Like how many weeks of this 24, or I guess like more like 12-week block, only because like certain national shows, like they'll be back to back, or they'll have like 2 to 3 week gaps in them. So when we're looking at the 2025 season, it's like Junior USA's that starts end of May. And we pretty much have national shows, I think all the way through the end of August, maybe. So it's like people who are hitting that circuit that are trying to secure that pro card, they might be committing to doing a 12-week cycle, even for the individual who's like, I'm only going to put it in place towards the end of my prep, or towards the point that I'm stage lean to really drive that look. So it's something just to consider if you are making like a really long run, or you have a long season ahead of you, and whether or not you have all the tools in place that are going to set you up and allow you to track any potential changes to vocal pitch. Now, mistake number 4, compound hopping. I think that there is this idea that's floating around, and I've heard it from individuals who've done consultations with me just to get a better sense of their cycle design. And they're like, okay, I'll run Anavar for 4 to 6 weeks, then I'll include Mastron, and then as I get into the Mastron cycle, I'll taper off Anavar, and then I'll put in Primo for those final 4 weeks to make up this 12-week cycle. And really what I want to say about this is total androgen exposure, total anabolic androgenic steroid exposure. That is what's going to encompass and lend to this idea that you could develop these masculine characteristics. And specifically when we're talking about switching to drugs, it's like you have to consider what is the likelihood that each of these drugs is what you think it is. And every drug dealer, every provider is going to vouch for their product. It's frankly a red flag if they don't. So as much as you might want to be optimistic and be like, oh, I found a source and they said it's tested and like it's really good, and everyone I've spoken with, no one's incurred side effects. It's like, okay, that's good. Yes, that's like where you want to start as at a baseline, but realistically, you also have to be skeptical. And if you have the ability, if you have the time, if you have the funds, I would recommend doing the testing yourself. Now, something I would be cognizant about is this concept that your body never really gets comfortable or adjusts to a single drug, and that being the key to avoiding virilization. This is simply not true. Anabolic steroids, they are also going to come with that risk of androgenicity, and no anabolic steroid is completely devoid of this risk. So we also have to consider the fact that you have a life bar over your head, basically saying like, okay, you can do this total amount of Anavar in your life before things start to get weird, things start to change. And realistically, there's no way to know that. And there are individuals who have, let's say, a shorter runway, or they have less of a life bar already, given that their voice might already be a little bit lower pitch, or they might already have a little bit darker facial hair or body hair. And these are all things that we really have to consider when we're implementing a drug as to whether or not it makes sense and whether or not there's an alternative to putting that drug in place. But simply just switching compound to compound, your vocal folds, they don't get this reset button each time you switch. It's not like receptor confusion is a thing. Your vocal folds don't get a reset button each time you switch compound. Like the larynx can't differentiate and be like, oh, okay, well, we didn't extend the cycle of Anavar to 8 weeks, so I better not change. And now you put in Masteron, and it's like, cool, okay, I got 6 weeks until things are going to begin to grow. Your body's identifying that there is an input that is androgenic. And the result is this continuous pressure to then cause masculinization. So what about if you are on a compound and you start to notice virilization, but at the dose that you're at and the duration of use, you're like, hey, this shouldn't be happening. Maybe the compound is not what I thought it was. Maybe I got Primobolan thinking it was Primo, and it was actually testosterone. In that case, yeah, switching compounds may be a good idea. And I can say for myself or for my clients, if this were to begin to occur, I would seriously consider whether or not I wanted to roll the dice again. I'd probably want to take some time off. I wouldn't want to go just into another cycle on the off chance that it happened a second time. And guys, we have medically guided, evidence-based, well-designed studies highlighting these androgenic changes that are desired. And we can look at these studies, we can look at this literature and show that trans men's experiences, they're really powerful in shaping adult voices, specifically with the use of hormone therapy. And this is something that we do see if a trans man stops testosterone therapy later, the voice remains in that lowered pitch. And this is exactly the risk that female athletes could potentially be exposing themselves to if they're using the wrong drug, if they're using the wrong dose, if they're using it at the wrong time, if they're using it for too long, or they're just simply misguided on what is going to dictate this risk profile. Once the cartilage and vocal folds adapt, there really is no returning to that previous pitch. And yes, there are surgeries like thyroplasty that aim to raise that pitch, but success is variable and it might not fully restore feminine pitch. So when we look at alternatives for individuals who have undergone some degree of virilization, masculinization specific to their voice, we can consider something like speech therapy that can help with resonance. It can help with controlling pitch breaks or reducing strain, but it can't physically reduce that newly thickened vocal fold. So none of these interventions should be seen as a reliable undo button. And ultimately, like with this video, that's the point I want to get across, is that we're talking about a change that for many would be frustrating, and not for all. Some are accepting of this risk, and this is where I think it's incredibly important to be very clear on what you feel embodies your femininity, and if voice and vocal pitch, if your range, if that's something that you identify and find to be a big component and a very important aspect of you remaining feminine, then this needs to be weighted against total lifetime exposure to anabolic androgenic steroids. So what about in the case that someone is pretty dead set that they understand the risk and they're in a situation where they very much are considering and are going to be using anabolics, or on the other end are already using anabolics but desire to monitor for these risks? This is the number one thing. I would use Voice Analyzer app. It's a very simple app. You just speak into it. It'll give you some kind of script, and I would be very consistent with how you're going about taking this. So in the case that you're sick or you're congested or you're inflamed, just know that these are times where that pitch might be a little stuffy, it might be a little lower, and it's not something that I think everyone has to do unless they are going to be using anabolics. But in the case that someone is risk averse and they're very concerned about these changes potentially occurring, I would just make this a part of your check-in process. I would read the same passage in the voice recorder and try to use the same resonance each and every time. So if you're someone that generally fluctuates your range, it would be important that you're not going into reading the passage and being very monotone. Now, if you begin to notice that your pitch is changing, or raspiness is creeping in, or you're noticing a ton of hoarseness or cracking, this would be a sign that there could be thickening and lengthening of the vocal folds. Now, in the case that you're not experiencing changes in vocal pitch, you're not noticing any changes in how you speak or how you sound, if you're still noticing other changes like increased hair growth, darker hair growth, acne, hair loss, clitoral megaly, like actual hypertrophy of the clitoris, this would be indicative that there are other forms of virilization, both reversible and irreversible, occurring. And this could be something that, you just begin to see these changes and you decide out the gate, cool, these happened, I'm not going to continue with the cycle. But I do recommend, in the case that you plan to use anabolics down the road, or you plan to continue the cycle, if you're noticing any kind of changes occurring, it would be worth getting a hormone panel done and looking at your total free test, your DHEA, and your DHT. Now, if you're a competitor or if you're an individual who's just interested in potentially using anabolics, it's important that you work with someone and that you have some kind of supervision from an individual who actually understands female physiology. And certain coaches, they can apply the same anabolic guidelines to women as they do men, ignoring how easily these changes can occur and also ignoring the detriment that it can put on the individual. I would also make sure that if you are planning to do multiple cycles, that you factor in dedicated breaks from androgen exposure. Now, follow-up questions that I get: is there any 100% safe anabolic compound for women? No anabolic androgenic steroid is completely devoid of the androgenic potential. And we also have to consider, even with SARMs, so selective androgen receptor modulators, yes, at low doses, these might not act the way that anabolics do, but there are two problems with this. Typically, the doses that individuals I see are running are not low doses, therefore we lose that selectivity. Second, typically, with SARMs, there is a question around quality control and accuracy. And we've seen in meta-analysis across the board that there are a lot of SARMs that once they're tested, come back as anabolics. Question number 2, what if I only do a short cycle, like 2 to 3 weeks? Realistically, even short stints can accumulate if repeated, and if genetically or at a baseline standpoint, you don't have a lot of runway in terms of experiencing changes, this would be something that I would weigh heavily against. I would also consider the fact that like 2 to 3 weeks, realistically, you're not going to build that much muscle. And if you only need a little bit of muscle, okay. But at the same time, I would say that if you're going to have the anabolic in place, you should get as much as you can out of it. And for a lot of individuals who are looking to change their physique in a significant way, as you would for a competition, I would recommend spending at least 6 weeks using that drug. And that just comes down to the likelihood that you're going to be able to get everything that you need out of the drug in 2 weeks is very low, as opposed to if you were able to use it for 6 weeks, get everything you need out of it, and then once you're done with the cycle, you're done. You've achieved that level of muscularity that you desire. Well, now you have no reason to put it back in place. Whereas if you do it 2 weeks, you only build a pound, or you're not even sure if you actually built, which I'm not saying you're going to build a pound in 2 weeks. It's very unrealistic. It is something that I think could put you in a little bit of a cycle of then starting a cycle, stopping a cycle, starting, stopping, and not really moving the needle in a meaningful way at any point. Well, taking breaks definitely prevent changes to my voice. Yeah, breaks can help, but they're not guaranteed. Some women's vocal cords are more sensitive and can shift even after short exposure. Let me close with this. You only get one natural voice. Hair can grow back, acne can clear, but your voice, once deepened, it's likely that it's going to be there for the rest of your life. And you really have to decide if the potential muscular or performance benefits from this exposure are worth it. And some advanced competitors might say yes, but I can say that I've spoken with many women who deeply regret it afterwards. And if you found this informative, I definitely encourage you to share this talk, this podcast, comment with any questions that you have about specific compounds or experiences. And if you're still on the fence about using an anabolic, especially as a female athlete, do your due diligence. Consult real professionals well-versed in female endocrinology, and definitely don't gamble on guesswork or online forums. Thank you guys for tuning in. As always, I will see you in the next one.